Hello, this is Jim Schaefer, executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. My guest today is Scott McCloud. Today we'll be discussing his book projects, including the remarkable book, Understanding Comics, The Invisible Art. Welcome to Rip Rap, Scott.
Thank you, Jim.
This has to be one of the most unusual topics we've ever done for a Rip Rap interview. But I love it because thanks to your book and your project, your work extends reflective critical thinking to comics, a genre of writing that's just starting to be understood in terms of its cultural significance. But first I'd like to set the scene, so to speak. How did you get involved with comics and drawing them and thinking about them?
With great reluctance, as it happens. When I was just a little kid, I was exposed to comics in the way that most people were in those days, and I didn't want anything to do with them. I read science fiction when I was, say, 10, 12 years old. I became interested in fine arts. I liked surrealist painting, things like this. Well, I had no interest in comics because they didn't seem to me to be an example of either good writing or good art, from what I saw. But a friend of mine in junior high school, that's what we called it up in the Northeast, I think a lot of places they call it middle school, named Kurt Busick, convinced me to sample his collection of comics. And that's when I became hooked. But he had to try very hard to get me to take a look at them, because I really looked down my nose at comics at the age of 13. And eventually the content itself won me over. And I also saw some examples of comics that I thought were more interesting, more adventurous. And then it wasn't that long before I saw a much broader range of comics, not just the superhero comics that my friend Kurt had, but comics from Europe and from Japan, comics with more ambition, comics like the work of Will Eisner or Art Spiegelman, that sort of thing. And that really turned me around on just the potential of the art form. So even when I was a little kid, really, it was more about potential than it was about history. I had this sense of what comics could do, and I was more interested in that than what comics had done.
Well, and in that era, it was more, was at your presentation, you talked about the Vaudevillian stage, it was all pointed and it was simple colors and that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, vaudeville really was very much the origins of comics. One of the key figures in early comics was a fellow named Winsor McCay, who's a key figure at the invention of the modern comic and at the invention of animation. And he performed on the vaudeville stage. He would do what were called chalk talks, where you would get up and draw right there on the stage and create these little dramas. And he also created an animation of this dinosaur who would walk on stage in the days when people had simply not been exposed to animation. He would have this drawing come to life, this dinosaur projected on a screen talking to him. People were astounded. But he was one of comics' founding fathers as well. And he and others who were brought up in the vaudeville tradition brought vaudeville conventions to the Sunday newspaper page as early as 1903. So you had that sense of the fixed camera, sitting in the front rows, watching goofy characters come on and off the screen, or on the stage, excuse me, and performing slapstick stunts. And they were just a fixed frame, one box after another, of crazy people in horse costumes falling down and pitchers of water being dumped on people's heads. That was vaudeville.
And they always faced the viewer.
They tended to face the viewer. And this was a tradition that you can still see traces of even today. But we've moved beyond it in a lot of ways in many other respects.
One of the things I thought was fascinating that you bring up in this book is about the way of mastering art. And there's those 5 phases you talk about. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that, because I think that's something that often people don't think about, that in particular comic books and comics, it looks like it's so easy to do. And so then they think it is easy to do, and it really is complex.
There are many different ways to look at the process of creating comics. There are traditional methods of creating the pictures, and that's what people tend to focus on. That is, making a preparatory sketch, inking the sketch, finalizing those lines, having them printed, adding color. But for me, I think there are more important, fundamental choices that artists are making. And there may be 5 areas, I think, that we can focus on. One of them is the choice of moment. This is something we never see in the printed comic because these are the choices that were made before the comic ever hit paper, before the drawings were even created, was that the writer and artist, usually one person these days, made decisions about which moments to include in their story and which to leave out, just as a film editor does, just as a scriptwriter does in film. They have to think, how many panels do I need to tell this part of the story? Do I need this sequence at all? Should I slow things down? Should I speed things up? That's choice of moment. Then there's choice of frame, where we decide where that frame lies, what distance we're going to shoot, to take a film analogy, what distance to shoot the scene from, whether to go close in for details or fall back to get a broader view of the scene, whether we should be tilting the scene, whether we should be seeing things from below or above, exactly as in film. Then there's choice of image, what sort of images to include, how to render those images, how we want to represent the reality. Then choice of word, which is self-explanatory, is the choice of what words to include as dialogue and as captions. What are the role of words in this comic, whether words are even necessary at all. And then finally, choice of flow, how our eye is guided from panel to panel and within the panels. And that I think is a more constructive way of looking at the process of making comics than simply focusing on the craft of creating pictures, which is a craft that there are many texts about out there. There are plenty of people who are willing to tell you how to create a convincing figure, say, or to ink a cityscape. But that's a skill that comics incorporates. The fundamental skill of comics is in understanding how to tell a story through a sequence of pictures.
Well, and I thought it was interesting that you really define comics in a more substantive way than what a lot of people think about them.
Well, sometimes controversial way, because people are very used, for instance, they're used to seeing the Sunday comics page as encompassing the world of comics. So to many people, I think, for better or for worse, in the upper left-hand corner, and something like Marmaduke or the Family Circus in the lower left-hand corner, they all belong in the same tent. Well, they do to a degree. They're all cartoons. But something like the Family Circus or the Far Side are single-panel cartoons. And they're primarily examples of the art of cartooning, that is, of drawing in a form that simplifies the world, that amplifies the world through simplification, that tries to get down to an essence of a form through line. So they're all cartoonists. But for me, I think comics is the art of when images are placed in sequence. And that's why, for better or worse, I would include in comics something like The Far Side or The Family Circus. I see more as the art of cartooning as something separate. It just happens to be all on the same page. But just as we don't include the crossword puzzle in any discussion of comics, I think it's appropriate not to include something like those single panels. And what happens when you do that, when you exclude just those few examples of single panel cartooning, is that you open up the world of comics to a vast array of other styles and approaches. It doesn't all have to look like the Sunday page. You can have series of photos, you can have a very painterly series of effects, you can have 3D digital modeling, you could even conceivably create sequential art, comics like sequential art, in the form of a series of sculptures. And this opens up comics to a much wider range of interpretations, and many people have been actively pursuing those and creating beautiful works of storytelling using just pictures that clearly fall within the tradition of comics, but look nothing like what we see on the Sunday pages.
Well, and you have some really fabulous ways of reaching back into the long-term historical context and perspective on connecting with other sequence narratives.
Well, yes, and it's dangerous to call them comics, of course, because clearly the artists of, say, the Tomb of Mena the Scribe from ancient Egypt, or something like the Bayeux Tapestry, didn't see themselves as part of a tradition of sequential art storytelling. But when you correct for language, if you were to say translate the words, when you correct for some of the idiosyncrasies of their mode of showing sequence, you realize you're looking at almost precisely the same form of art. It's so clearly the same form of art. Some of the Egyptian wall paintings I found, for example, you'll have a series of horizontal bars, and then within them you'll have a scene here, a scene here, a scene here, and each is telling you a process, a procedure, say of agriculture or government, that's taking place in discrete units of time, and you can follow it across, then up, then over, then up, then over, then up, and then over. It goes in a zigzag, but I think ultimately that's a trivial distinction between the fact that it's not in the same sort of enclosed border, and it may not follow quite the same pattern of reading, but it's using that same vocabulary. Something like the Bayeux Tapestry tells it entirely from left to right, again as a series of chronological battle scenes, from the Norman conquest. There are pre-Columbian picture manuscripts. All of these things are tapping into the same basic idea. Now, you get something much more like what we see today in comics as early as the 1400s, where some European broadsheets used rectilinear panel borders, line drawings of events. I have one that I show often called The Tortures of St. Erasmus, which, even though many of the tortures could have been shown in any sequence, we have St. Erasmus is brought before his tormentors in the first two panels, and his head is cut off in the last. So clearly sequence was a concern when they organized the thing. And then within about 150 years, you have captions, you have word balloons, you have actual scrolls coming out of people's mouths with dialogue. And at that point, really, the differences between those comics from, say, the 1500s or early 1600s and what we see today, it's really trivial from a formal standpoint. You're looking at clearly the same form of art, just as medieval music is the same broad form of art as a song by Radiohead.
Well, it's just stunning when you point this out. It's stuff that you can see, but then you don't get the connection and the line of continuity through it.
Right. Well, I think you may have a line of continuity when you go from the European broadsheets on up, but you clearly don't have a line of continuity when you go from something like Trajan's Column or the Bayeux Tapestry. So, for many people, to see something as part of an art form, there needs to be that cultural continuity, the idea that they're passing on a tradition, that it's connected. But I would offer that if we had a way of knowing that some disconnected civilization without a connection to today's civilizations had nevertheless discovered the form of music, say, had been making sounds to please their ears, a system of organized sounds, using the natural world to create those sounds for their own enjoyment, we'd still call it music, regardless of whether that music had influenced the music of our day, regardless of whether we could find a bloodline, an aesthetic bloodline going back to that time. It would still be music. It would be music if they did it on Mars and we discovered it millions of years later. We would still see that as the same form of expression. I think that sequential art it's equivalent to music, to the written word, to dance. I think that's the status I'd like to see it.
Well, in your book,
achieve.
you have all kinds of parallels with that too, music and Picasso and Klee and.
Oh, sure. Well, some of the principles of art move across all boundaries of art.
How did you get this particular dimension of involvement with comics?
I don't know. I think it's probably just my nature. My father was an engineer, an inventor. I think it's my nature to approach whatever art form I came across. I was probably going to approach it in an analytical way. In some ways, it may just be an accident of history that I wound up with the wrong job. Perhaps I should have been an electrical engineer or a chemist or something like that. And because I was dropped into this particular job, I just approached it as somewhere there's a scientist who's probably too artistically disposed and equally a fish out of water. I don't know.
You identify comics as the invisible art, and that's
Yes.
the title. And so maybe we can talk about that part of what you're talking about.
Well, sure. It has a few meanings. In the one sense, comics is an invisible art in its cultural role in our society. I think that may not be as true as it was when I wrote the book. I'm happy to say that there's been a lot of progress since 1993 when that book originally came out. So that's on the one hand there, but that was the idea that it is an art form which is invisible to many for all its accomplishments as an art form. Perhaps more importantly to the title was the notion of the invisible world that comics illuminates, especially the invisible world between the panels. For me, that was an essential component of comics grammar, was this idea that the artist gives us something to see within the panels, but it's the reader's job to imagine what's happening between the panels. And what's shown us within the panels there has a lot in common with other art forms, with other visual art forms. But what happens between the panels is something that only happens in comics. And it's that leap of faith, that call and response structure of what the artist gives and then what the reader gives back again and again and again and again, that rhythm of comics that makes comics so unlike prose or other visual arts or motion pictures or anything else. So it's the invisible art because it's the invisible mortar between those visible bricks that defines what comics is for me, or at least what I find most exciting about comics.
I also found it fascinating that sometimes it's like the old story about you could be in New York and not go see the Statue of Liberty. That the comics are so pervasive and ubiquitous in our daily life that we haven't taken the time to understand how they work and why we think that they're interesting.
Yes.
And that's what I found was interesting with your book, is you took the time and the energy and a considerable amount to understand that. The other thing is it seems to be, as you argue in your book, developing as a distinct genre that has its own particular characteristics because there's a nonlinearity and there's a flexibility available within it that isn't available in other forms of art.
Well, that's true, although ideally we'd like it to move beyond its genre status entirely. Because I think when we speak of genres, like, say, science fiction or romance, we're speaking of a vocabulary of styles, techniques, an outlook on the world. And while I think comics' outlook on the world has contributed in a valuable way to the cultural discourse, I think we would like to believe that it's capable of any such outlook. You know, just as music itself is a blank slate. In a way, it's just sort of a clinical demarcation of a wide range of genres, a wide range of expressions, for everything from classical music on up to Coldplay or something, whatever's going on right now in music. I think we'd like to see comics as being capable of a wide range of genre expressions too. Now, speaking of the current crop of comics, what's going on in, say, the graphic novel scene in America or in the international exchange of ideas in comics today, there I think you can see what we could call a genre of tremendous subtlety, or at least, at its best, tremendous subtlety and challenging complexity. But it really, comics now it's a form of many genres, and it's especially right now in 2006. I think that's one of the most striking things of comics, is that the hot points for comics are so different from one another. There's a tremendous influx of work being done from Japan, which is grabbing a whole new generation of younger readers. There's the graphic novel movement, which is allowing comics to grow up and capture the imagination of readers of adult fiction and more sophisticated observers of the scene. And then there's the work being done on the web, which has tremendous formal variety and is this wild mutation that's heading in 1,000 new directions all at once. Those three areas of comics, three genres you might say, are completely unlike one another, and they illuminate different aspects of the form. And I think that's very healthy, because you get a better picture of what comics can do if you have people heading at it from very different viewpoints.
I also found it fascinating. You make a lot of comments that has to do with perception. That, here you have in the old comics, essentially, color or ink on paper, but you hear sound and you may even smell things because of how it's portrayed, and that sense of closure, I think, was the thing you keep talking about. We
do. I think we do get a sense of all five senses. I mean, because comics asks us to represent the world with just one, with sight. But we're encouraged through the best comics to imagine all five. And I think that space between the panels in particular, where we close our eyes, where we don't even have the sense of sight, I think that's the realm where all five senses come to bear in our imagination.
One of the questions I've got is, in this book project that's coming out shortly, are you going to be exploring your thoughts on the cultural differences between East and West? Because there's a lot that you talk about in this book that I found really fascinating.
I do. Actually, that comes back, especially in regards to the differences between Western comics and Japanese comics. It's especially relevant for a lot of artists today, of course, because Japanese comics are just now seizing on a young generation, as they did on me when I was in my 20s. I became really fascinated with Japanese comics. And I had a disadvantage because I couldn't read Japanese, and the things hadn't been translated yet. But that, I suppose maybe in some ways it wasn't a disadvantage, because it meant that I came to understand their mode of storytelling, visual storytelling, and I could more easily gauge when that visual storytelling was so good that you didn't even need to understand the language. I could just read them panel to panel to panel. And the right to left thing was easy enough to, to master. But yes, so I do talk about that in the new book, especially with a practical orientation of trying to help especially younger readers who are enchanted with manga to understand why, to understand what it is that manga does that American comics still generally don't do. One of the key things, even though there are many, many different techniques, many of them fall under the category of involvement. The notion that you're creating a sense of involvement and participation in the work on the part of the reader, spatially and emotionally, temporally. For example, the way that Japanese comics traditionally represent motion is different than it is here. Often the character will be perceived in a static fashion while the entire background, the environment around them, is streaking by, which recalls the idea of moving with an object. If you're to take a photograph of a moving motorcycle from a car next to the motorcycle, you'll have that phenomenon where the motorcycle is perfectly in focus and it's only the background that's streaked. So there, the idea, unlike American comics, is you aren't watching a moving object, you are moving alongside the moving object, a sense of participation. Also, there are many expressive techniques for emotions that get us inside the minds of characters. The framing, the choice of angles is more oriented towards a sense of following someone. Characters are more often shot from the back in manga. It's just a simple thing, and yet this is especially in the action manga, in the boys manga. But that gives us a sense of following them into action rather than having them perform a play for us, which is what many American comics still do after all these years. That little trace of vaudeville in our blood. American comics often play to the audience, but that means they're kind of blocking us at the door. You don't follow the characters into their world because they're always there, always telling you, always at the frame, facing you, checking it out, making sure that they're pleasing you, that you can see every detail of their body. They're hams. They hog the camera. And I don't see that as much in Japanese comics. So it's one of many, many techniques that all funnel into that primary goal, probably not a conscious goal necessarily, but that effect that Japanese comics have of creating reader involvement.
Different response. There's a stunning illustration in this book where you had the bleeding off the page. In other words, the illustration completely filled the page, and that was something that comes up, as you said, in the Japanese comics. It doesn't come up, at least at that time, in American comics.
At that time, it was more unusual in American comics. Some people used it, but they used it, I think, more indiscriminately. Those who used it in America used it as a design, something to punch up the design of the work for its graphic possibilities. I found that, and this was true in Japanese comics at the time, it may not be as true now, but at the time I found that they tended to use it more strategically in Japanese comics. They had a particular effect that they were going for. Bleeds were often used when they wanted to establish a sense of place, give you a sense of the world just bleeding off the edges of the page, leaking into your world, so that images would linger. You'd have much more a use of silence, actually, in Japanese comics. There were more silent.
That's what I thought was fascinating, too, is the use of silence and subjectivity.
Yes.
A way of creating character and the moment.
Yeah. It's very effective. Well, effective enough now that suddenly Japanese comics have crossed the pond, and a tremendous number of people are reading them, especially younger readers.
So what's the name of this new book?
Oh, the new book is named Making Comics,
Making Comics.
following in the footsteps of its predecessors, and it is a how-to, but it's hopefully not your ordinary how-to book. It includes quite a bit of a broader context, broader look at the art form, but always with an eye towards the act of creating your own work and what goes into that and the sort of choices involved. And I'm not shy about advocating for certain things, for a greater sense of place, for some of the things I think are missing from American comics, trying to encourage artists not to be a slave to the close-up, something that we suffer from and have for many years, and to consider all of their options, to not just follow in the footsteps of those who've gone before, but hopefully create works that will help illuminate the art form and make people question what's gone before and go
I think
beyond
you
that.
have some advice for young budding comic artists about the things that they really have to attend to, and I think one of them you said was lettering.
It's very ironic. Yes, people ask me what separates professional from amateur comics work, and strangely enough, though it goes against all my instincts, I have to admit at this point that probably the one thing that'll mark your work as amateurish is bad lettering. It's the silliest thing. For all the more profound things that go into making a great work, no matter how good it looks, if the lettering is bad, it's always gonna mark you. It's like I don't know, like bad sound or bad lighting in movies or something.
That and lack of background, I think, was
Lack of back. Oh yes, that's a big one. All your characters looking the same. That's something a lot of
That has to do
amateurs
with the aesthetic of the art form, I think, that what you're talking about.
Well, it says of the genre. I think
The
that's
genre.
really, yeah, that's where the traditional genres of comics sometimes lead us astray, and that's where I think a broader view of the form, and really of all forms, is a good idea. Of course, as with anything, it's always good to look beyond your chosen art, and try to, well, what I always say is to learn from everyone, follow no one, watch for connections, and just work like hell. I think if you do those four things, you're in pretty good shape.
Well, I found your book to be really wonderful. I'm looking
Thank you.
forward to seeing the next one. And I thought it was a fresh look at art, really, from a different perspective that I didn't expect. And I thought it was thoroughly enjoyable, and I think that it's really helpful to have these come up, another look at something that's very serious. I mean, it deals with all these basic elements of art aesthetics.
Well, I thank you, and I think that probably virtually any art could be subjected to the same light, really. I think many things that we may not take that seriously, when looked at for their potential, might show similar complexity and depth. They're
Thank
out
you for
there.
being on Rip Rap.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.